Hi everyone, my name is Eric and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I built this workbench. But first, let me show you some of its features. This workbench includes both my table saw and miter saw. The miter saw sits in a notch on the bench, which then can be removed so I have a full-length flat tabletop. I also added some storage inside the workbench which can hold all the tools I need for common projects. On the back side, I then added a power bar and then installed the DeWalt table saw and made adjustments so it fit perfectly. To finish it off, I added casters to make the bench mobile. Okay, so the first thing to do here is figure out what we're even doing. As you can see, I made a 3D model to scale on SketchUp, which is a free software, and I'm just recording those measurements of each part in my notebook. From here I have a precise cut list and everything is nice and simple for me because all the math and calculations I will need to do are already finished in the model. If you're interested in building this bench, I have a 3D model link in the description so you can view the plans until you get to your dimensions. Just keep in mind that this SketchUp model was just a starting point, and especially since I had warped wood, I had to be creative and find new solutions for the plan. Now that I created my cut list, which I'll put in the description, let's start cutting all the pieces and then go from there. I started with the 2x4s and just went down the list of cuts to make. One thing I recommend is planning out your cuts to reduce the amount of scrap wood you're left with. As I said in the beginning, I made this bench with around 7 2x4s, but if you plan it right, you could for sure bring it down to 5 or 6. After cutting all the 2x4s I needed, I moved on to the 2x8s. Some of you may be wondering why I'm using 2x8s and saying how it's unnecessary, and you may be right, but luckily for me, I got them all for free from my nono, so the question is, why wouldn't I use them? If you want to save some money, you could just use some 2x6s instead of the 2x8s, and they should work just fine. Next, since the 2x8s were a bit rough and dirty, I just sanded it down with some 60 grit sandpaper. Alright, so we got all the pieces cut. Now it's time to move on to the assembly. So here I'm just going back and forth, referencing the 3D model and placing the boards where they should go. Now that I have a rough idea in my head, I drilled what seemed to be an endless amount of pocket holes in all the boards. For the 2x4s, 2 screws on each end is a perfect amount, while on the 2x8s, I drilled 3 holes on each end. At the same time, I also cut notches for the 2x4s to rest on in the table legs. I used the DeWalt jigsaw, which is amazing by the way, and cut my holes. Okay, so this is what we have done so far. We've got the legs connected by the 6x3 board. And basically what I'm doing is doing a test fit. And just seeing how well it lines up. So then we'll work our way from there. Okay, so let's do a test fit. And yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so now from here, we're going to screw these in, making sure they're straight. So what we're gonna do now, once we connected the 2x8 to the other legs, is we're gonna run two 2x4s through these notches, basically just for extra support, because this is gonna be holding up a miter saw, a table saw, and whatever else I put on the table. So I want it to be strong as possible. And remember, this is the bottom side, so this is gonna be resting on the 2x4s that we run here. So yeah, we're just gonna connect it with some 2.5-inch screws, maybe 2 on each leg, and then yeah, that'll be it. Alright, so now we got 2x4s in place. And I was thinking about putting a screw into the 2x8 from the 2x4 here that's running along the whole entire bench. But I think I want to leave it because I'm okay with a tiny bit of flex. As you can probably see that these two aren't touching because, you know, the cuts weren't perfect, nothing was perfect. So basically I'm just going to leave it for now. In the future, if I want to, I literally just take a screw and shoot it through there and shoot it through here. And, you know, maybe lift it up a little bit so it's in place, but for now I think it's okay. Okay, so let's go see what we have to do next on the design. Okay, so here's our 3D design. Going off based what we have already right there. Alright, so now we got the frame done, the major parts. Now we just have the little things like the 2x4 for the table saw, the kind of box for the miter saw here, and then we got the, I guess you could call it framing for these parts here at the very end of the bench. Okay, so I'm gonna get started on all the 2x4s except for the ones under the table saw. This one here, beside the hole for the rail, and then the ones for the miter box. And the reason I'm doing this is because a lot of that's fitting. The miter box, you're gonna have to measure the height of the saw. The table saw I wanna leave to the end when I fit it in because, you know, it's in a regular shape. I'm not exactly sure where this should be. This is just an estimate. And then especially for this one here, it's just a rough estimate again. So take note on that when you're looking at the design for yourself, if you're looking to build it. So yeah, I'm gonna get started at the end, where we have these two 2x4s at the top, and some at the bottom and all over the place. So let's get started on that. All right, so we have our 2 feet boards and they're just gonna go in here. So they're just gonna sit like that, and then we're gonna use the pocket holes that we drilled from before and just screw them in. Alright, so as you just saw, we tested the table saw and we traced the guide on these two 2x8s, which we're going to cut. Alright, so we got the notches in place. Let's go bring the table saw back and see how it fits. Okay, so let's get it tested. And while I'm doing this, I have the table saw in place. I'm going to measure where I should put my next 2x4 for extra support. I think I want to put it just around there. Okay, let's take this off and get that 2x4 in place. Okay, so now we're gonna get our 1 foot 9 inch board, and we're just gonna fit it into here. Alright, so I could use a table saw for this, but my workspace is not really that big, so I'm going to use just a circular saw instead. I'm also making sure to score the line I'm cutting and also put some tape on there. I just saw that on YouTube, apparently it's pretty good because I just want a perfectly clean cut. And this is the bad side of the wood, so this is going to be on the bottom. So when I'm cutting, I want that to be on the top. That's for specifically the circular saw. Okay, so we got the plywood in. I'm going to screw this into place, test with the table saw, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so let me give you a tour of what I've done so far. So basically what I did is just level this table saw with some plywood. Now that I leveled it, there's around a 1/2 inch gap between the top of the table saw and this here, because when we cut these pieces, they're gonna sit like this, right? And you don't want it to be hitting it here, because then the pieces of wood that you slide on the table saw, they're gonna hit into that, and that can cause kickback and all that type of stuff. So you can see it's just above that plywood. All right, so basically what I did to cut these pieces, and these pieces just sit down on here. You know, it's for function and looks, you know. I wanted to make sure there's a bit of an overhang in case I want to clamp anything on there. So yeah, I cut these with a jigsaw. It literally took me maybe 2 minutes for both of them combined. So I just traced it out, took it on the jigsaw, cut it. Nice and simple, and it works. All right, so I'm gonna show you what I did for the miter blocks. As you can see here, it's just held up with some 2x4s for extra support at each corner. And then from there, what I did is I just made a little frame with a 2x4 running across on each end. Then I did a little runner, a 1x1 going across to support the plywood. And that's basically it. All right, so before I added the plywood, I figured I'd add a little shelf here. So I just added another piece of plywood that I obviously had extra. Added some screws at the bottom, and that's just to support the legs. So here's the plywood all fitted in place. Then I cut a hole in one of the sheets for dust collection. And yeah, don't mind the workshop sandals, by the way. They're comfortable, alright? Alright, so since we switched the plans a little bit for the miter saw box, I think I'm going to connect the plywood to the top differently, or at least have a better system of connecting it to the top when I want to take the miter saw off and have a flat surface going throughout the entire table. And I think the way I want to do that basically is just taking a 2x4, putting it in there, and it's just basically some flaps that we can hang the plywood on. And when I'm talking about plywood, I'm talking about this sheet right here, because this is not screwed in to the 2x4s, it's just sitting in place. And that's because, say I want to take off the miter saw, I just carry the miter saw off and then slide the plywood out. And then I want to have a way to put that plywood on top of here so it creates a flat surface. Okay, so you know what kind of plan I'm having now. Now I'm just going to take the miter saw off and test out my ideas. Okay, so I got the pieces cut to size. Cut this one a bit shorter, so it sits flat on that side. And I cut it a bit shorter on this side, so the plywood just clears this. These are just to hold it up so I can see if it's fitting or not. This I left the same, and then yeah, obviously I cut this smaller. So again, it just clears that piece of plywood there, so it's able to slide down and slide into place when we take it out and put it on top. So the next step, and the only step left, is basically measure the space here and then there, and then see what kind of thickness of a block you need for the plywood to be able to sit on there. Okay, so I got it in place. I got all the plywood cut properly. So now all I'm gonna do, put some screws in here, 1, 2, 3, and that will be plenty enough to hold up just that little sheet of plywood there. Alright, so as you can see, this worked out pretty damn well. There's almost no gap here at all. A bit more on this side, but that's fine. I kind of wanted it that way anyway. So yeah, I added just a little bit of blocks here. Let me show you just how it works when I want to, for example, put the miter saw in. So yeah, that's basically it. It took me maybe 10 seconds to just take the plywood from the top, put it on the bottom, and then I just put the miter saw on. Very, very simple, but it works and it's very sturdy. Like this does not move, like it's sturdy. But yeah, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so after I made the holders for the plywood, I added another strip at the back to stop it from moving forwards and backwards when I push the miter saw. Then I sanded everything down with 220 grit for the plywood and 100 grit for the rest of the frame. I also drilled a little hole here so I could slide the sheet easier. So after I finished sanding, we could finally drill the plywood into place. I started installing the front pieces so I can straighten all the other pieces based off those. First aligning these parts, drilling the pilot holes, using a special bit to allow the screws to sit flush, and then drilling the 1.5-inch screws into place. Next on the list is optional, but I decided to route the edges to make them smoother. I'd recommend maybe just sanding the edges instead, so that there aren't any problems when using clamps. So then I came back with some wood filler to cover those holes. I bought some from the store, but next time I would definitely try mixing some wood dust and glue to get a better color match. And now for the top coat. For this, I just used a tough clear coat of polyurethane and brushed it on generously. For this, I use a foam brush, but I would definitely recommend using just a bristle brush. I finished varnishing the bench and came back the next day to complete the very final step in this project. Alright, so we're on our final step of the bench, and that is to add casters. But I think I'll just do a time lapse, so enjoy the time lapse right now. Alright, so that's all there is. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any ideas for the next video, or even something I can add to this bench, feel free to leave it in the comment section. Thanks for building with me. My name is Eric, and I'll see you in the next one.